All my little brother did was put on an old costume and we lost him forever. A few years ago, my little brother found an old costume in our attic right before Halloween. I don't know where it came from. I'd never seen it before, and my parents didn't remember buying it. It was this dusty, strange suit with long, worn-out arms, wiry fabric that looked like coarse hair, and a mask with jagged teeth, dark hollows for eyes, and horns that looked disturbingly real. He loved it immediately, like he just found some lost treasure. We all thought it was pretty cool at first, creepy and weird, but perfect for Halloween. He put it on right away, refusing to take it off, and started acting like a monster, chasing us around the house. We all laughed, but the costume looked unsettling in a way none of us could quite shake. I remember watching him through the kitchen window as he played outside, and I noticed how his movements started to seem more animal than kid. By the time Halloween rolled around, he was practically living in that costume, sleeping in it and wearing it every chance he got. My parents would make him take it off for meals and bedtime, but he'd always put it right back on the moment he could. It was almost like he couldn't stand to be without it. That night, we went out for trick-or-treating as usual. But my brother had changed somehow. His voice sounded rougher, lower, as he growled and stomped around the neighborhood. At first, people thought he was just doing a really good job playing his part, but he didn't break character once. When we approached groups of kids, he'd snarl and bare his teeth, making them scream and run away. Parents were whispering, giving him weird looks, some even steering their kids to the other side of the street. After a while, his behavior got so intense that people stopped thinking it was funny. Kids were crying, parents were yelling, but he just kept going. His growl became deeper than I'd ever heard before. The mask, or what I thought was the mask, seemed fused to his face, and those teeth, they didn't look like rubber anymore. They looked sharp, gleaming white and oddly wet under the streetlights. As the night went on, he became less recognizable, his limbs longer, twisted in ways that didn't look right. The hair of the costume seeming to spread up his neck. His face looked like it was stretching, twisting into an awful expression, and his eyes had taken on this sickly yellow hue. When I tried to tell him to stop, his gaze cut through me, a gaze I'd never seen before, as if he didn't know who I was at all. Eventually, people started to panic. Parents shouted at him to leave, to get out of their neighborhood, dragging their kids away. I think they could sense, just like I could, that this was no longer some kid in a costume, no longer my brother. He didn't argue or cry, he just bolted. He took off down the road, skittering on all fours, the costume almost part of him now, blending into his skin like he'd always been this creature. The crowd backed away, watching him with horror as he ran into the woods, disappearing into the darkness, leaving nothing but the echo of a low growl and the distant snap of branches. We searched for him for days. Our family and even the whole town joined in, combing through the trees, checking every hiding spot. My parents even kept his bed made up, hoping he'd come back. But all they ever found were scratch marks on trees, some strange fur snagged on the branches, and footprints so huge they looked like they belonged to something much larger than him. Since then, every Halloween, people say they hear something deep in the woods at night, a creature lurking, waiting, watching. Kids dare each other to go to the edge of the trees, but none stay for long. They say you can hear the faint growl of something stalking from the shadows, and if you look hard enough, you might see yellow eyes staring back. To this day, I'm not sure what happened. All I know is that my brother isn't coming back. Last night, my friends and I went trick-or-treating, figuring we'd go one last time for nostalgia's sake. We were working our way down the street, bags already half full, when we reached the very end of the neighborhood, where most people never bothered going. There, almost hidden behind thick trees, was a house I'd never noticed before. It was huge, Victorian style. Faded gray paint peeling off the walls, the windows dark. We debated whether to approach it, but curiosity got the best of us. We went up the steps, half joking about who would dare knock. Before any of us reached the door, though, it creaked open by itself, revealing a dark hallway lined with dusty, ancient-looking furniture. One of us thought it was just a Halloween decoration, or someone pulling a prank, so we all laughed it off and walked inside. The door slammed shut the second we stepped in. It was so loud that it rattled the windows, and the lock clicked, trapping us in. We tried to laugh it off, pretending it was no big deal, but the sound echoed around us in a way that left us all tense and quiet. The house smelled stale, like it hadn't been touched in decades, and the air seemed colder than outside. Each room we passed seemed untouched and strangely organized, as if everything was in its place but not by human hands. As we ventured deeper, something felt subtly wrong. My friend Jake was the first to vanish. He was in front, flashlight in hand, leading us down a narrow hallway. When we turned a corner and realized he wasn't there, only his flashlight on the floor. We called his name, thinking he'd gone ahead to scare us, but there was only silence. We waited, expecting him to pop out, but he didn't. One of us tried the door we'd just come through, but it wouldn't budge. We were trapped. Then it was Alex. We turned into what looked like a parlor, dimly lit by a single dusty lamp. In the center of the room was a grand piano, and for some reason it seemed almost too inviting, as if it was waiting for us. We were huddled around it, half joking and trying to act brave, when I noticed that Alex had stayed behind, just standing in the doorway. I blinked, and he was gone, leaving nothing but the eerie silence hanging in the air. The rest of us were starting to panic. We called out for Alex and Jake, shouting, but the house just swallowed our voices. Every sound seemed to die as soon as it left our mouths. We had no idea how to get out, and no one had their phones. They were still in our bags, dropped somewhere near the front door. We decided to split up, thinking we'd cover more ground and find each other faster. Looking back, I know that was the worst decision we could have made. I went down a side corridor, telling myself that I'd just check 1 or 2 rooms. But no matter how many doors I opened, there was no end to them. It was like each room led to another hall, each hallway stretching on longer than the one before, and I kept feeling like I was walking in circles. Then I heard a scuffling noise, like footsteps behind me, but when I looked back, the hall was empty. I turned the corner again, and my friend Matt was gone too. He'd been right there beside me, his face pale, eyes wide with fear. I'd looked away for just a second, but now he was gone, like he'd vanished into thin air. My heart pounded, and a dread I can't even describe set in. There was no sound, no trace of him at all. The house felt like it was expanding, rooms multiplying in every direction, trapping me further in its endless maze. Desperate, I sprinted down the hallway, trying to find anything that looked like an exit. I flung open doors that only led to more empty rooms, each more twisted and decayed than the last. Finally, I found a staircase that I was certain hadn't been there before. I raced down, taking steps 2 at a time, hoping it would lead me back to the front door. When I reached the bottom, there it was, the entry hall, and I could see the door just a few feet away. My heart was racing, and I barely dared to believe I'd made it out. I ran to the door, but the hallway seemed to stretch, pulling it farther away with every step. I felt trapped in an endless loop, my legs burning as I ran, the distance only growing. Just as I was about to give up, the door was right in front of me. I grabbed the handle, twisted it opened, and I burst out onto the front porch, practically falling onto the steps. The cold night air hit me, but when I turned back, the house looked different. The door was closed and the windows were dark, like nothing had happened. I stood there for a long moment, staring at the house, half expecting my friends to come out after me. They never did. Last night was supposed to be the best Halloween of our lives. The weather was perfect, crisp, just enough breeze to rustle the leaves, and the whole neighborhood went all out with decorations. It was the first time our parents let us go trick-or-treating on our own, so my friends and I decided to make a night of it, hitting every house on the block and then some. We had our costumes on, bags ready, and the streets were packed with other kids, laughing and yelling in excitement. It was all great until we made it to the far side of town, where the houses get sparser and the streetlights more distant. The energy there felt strange, quiet in a way that didn't match the lively neighborhood we'd just come from. But we were determined to push through. The houses there were known to give out the best candy, and we weren't about to miss out. After a few houses, one of my friends spotted someone a ways behind us, standing under one of the flickering streetlights. I thought it was just another trick-or-treater, but they didn't move, didn't even look around. They just stood there, facing us. Their costume was creepy. It looked like they were wearing a tattered cloak or a long coat, and their face was hidden by some kind of crude mask. I tried to shrug it off. There are always some creepy costumes on Halloween, right? But when we started to move, so did they, staying just close enough to keep us in view. We picked up the pace, eager to put some distance between us and whoever this was. The houses were spaced farther apart here, so there was a lot of darkness between each one, and I couldn't shake the feeling that the figure was matching our steps in every shadow, keeping just out of sight whenever we looked back. One of us finally suggested turning down a side street, hoping we could lose them by taking a different route. We ducked around the corner and hurried past a row of houses, listening for any sign that they'd followed. But there was only the dead silence of an empty street behind us. For a minute, we thought we'd lost them. Then, just as we let ourselves breathe, we spotted the figure again, standing at the end of the block like they'd known exactly where we'd be. They were closer now, and in the faint glow from a porch light, I noticed something strange about the way they moved. Every step seemed jerky, unnatural, as if they were struggling to stay upright, and the mask, it wasn't a mask. I still can't put my finger on what it was exactly, but the face looked rough, almost like it had been torn from somewhere else and put on wrong. I swear I saw their mouth twitch, just a brief curl, and that was enough to get us running. We sprinted down the street, desperate to find more people, more lights, anything that could break the eerie quiet and make us feel safe. But no matter how fast we went, the figure was always there, cutting across lawns, slipping through shadows, closing the distance every time we looked back. We tried to split up, thinking it would confuse them or slow them down, but that only seemed to make things worse. I heard one of my friends scream, and when I looked over my shoulder, I saw them stumble, dropping their candy bag as they disappeared into the dark. The figure didn't pause, didn't even acknowledge them, just kept coming, one by one, narrowing in on the rest of us. Eventually, there were only 3 of us left, panting and terrified, ducking behind fences and between houses. The streets were almost empty now. Most people had gone home, and the few who remained didn't seem to notice anything unusual. We tried banging on doors, but no one answered. It was like we were in a different world where nothing and no one could help us. By the time we made it back to my street, I realized the figure was gone. The street was quiet, nothing unusual in sight, just the comforting glow of porch lights and the occasional laugh from distant houses. We stood there, gasping for breath, waiting to see if they'd come back, but the figure had vanished. When we finally made it home, we tried to tell our parents, but they just brushed it off, saying we were overexcited or letting our imaginations get the best of us. They didn't see the faces we did, the twisted, unnatural way that figure moved. They didn't feel that cold, creeping dread that had followed us every step of the way. I don't know who or what that was, and I haven't seen my friend since. The police said they'd look into it, but I can tell they don't believe us, that they think it's just another Halloween prank gone wrong, but I know what I saw. Last night, 4 of us decided to explore the Baker house on the edge of town. Everyone knows it's the spot for ghost hunting. A crumbling 2-story mess, rotting wood and boarded windows, the whole horror movie setup. The place has been abandoned for decades, and no one dares to go near it. Local stories say that people who enter the house don't always come back the same, or sometimes they don't come back at all. So, naturally, we thought it would be the perfect Halloween adventure. We came prepared with flashlights, a couple of cameras, and even an old spirit box to see if we could catch anything. It felt thrilling at first, all of us laughing nervously as we stepped inside, feeling like we were starring in our own horror story. The floorboards groaned with every step, the smell of decay seeping through the walls. The place was almost pitch black, save for the occasional moonlight spilling through broken slats in the walls. About 10 minutes in, we split up, figuring we'd cover more ground. I stayed with my friend Danny while the others went further down the hall. We could hear the others calling out, testing the spirit box, but soon the chatter faded, swallowed up by the dead silence of the house. Then Danny was gone. 1 second. He was right beside me. The next, there was nothing but the faint sound of shuffling. I thought he was just messing around, trying to scare me, so I kept moving, hoping he'd jump out to get a reaction. But there was no sound of footsteps or laughter, nothing to suggest he was hiding somewhere nearby. Just emptiness. I called out, trying to be casual about it, but the quiet that followed was absolute. I could feel my pulse picking up, the realization settling in that he was genuinely gone. I tried to retrace my steps, but the hallway seemed longer than it had when we first walked through. Shadows seemed to hang in places where there shouldn't have been any, stretching across walls and swallowing up corners. I went back to the main room, hoping maybe the others had seen Danny. But when I got there, I found only Mark, standing alone, his flashlight shaking in his grip. He hadn't seen Danny either, and now Claire was missing too. He said she'd gone up the stairs but hadn't come back down. I wanted to leave right then, but Mark insisted we look for her. Against my better judgment, I agreed. We climbed the staircase, every step echoing through the empty house. The wood creaked underfoot, and it felt like the entire house was pressing in around us, the walls closer and narrower than they had seemed before. When we reached the top, the hallway stretched out in both directions, lined with doorways that led into rooms swallowed in darkness. We started checking them one by one, and each room seemed emptier than the last, like they were stripped of anything remotely human. When I turned back, Mark was gone. No noise, no fading footsteps, just gone. I called out, scanning the hallway with my flashlight, every nerve in me screaming to get out of there. It was like the house had swallowed him whole. I bolted back down the stairs, practically stumbling over my own feet, desperate to escape. I don't know how I made it back to the main floor, but somehow I did. I could feel the weight of the silence around me, thick and suffocating, and every instinct screamed that I was being watched. Shadows seemed to gather in the corners, and the darkness felt alive, stretching and twisting in ways it shouldn't. I forced myself to move to just get to the door, but as I did, a strange humming noise started to fill the room, a low, haunting resonance that seemed to pulse from the walls. I finally reached the door and threw it open, stumbling out into the cold night. When I looked back, the Baker house was as silent and unmoving as it had been when we'd first arrived. I didn't see any sign of my friends, no shadows in the windows, no shapes moving in the hallways. Just that dreadful emptiness staring back at me. I called the cops, but they didn't find anything. No sign of Danny, Claire, or Mark. Nothing. It's like they were never there at all. They told me I must have been mistaken, that maybe my friends played a prank on me. But I know what I saw. Or didn't see. They didn't just disappear. It felt like something in that house took them, swallowed them up. Now I can't sleep. I keep thinking I'll see them in the shadows of my own room, faces pale and eyes hollow, reaching out from whatever hell that house trapped them in. Last night was supposed to be a quiet Halloween spent checking out an old graveyard a few miles from town. It's not really on the beaten path, just a spot by the woods where the headstones are half buried under moss, dates faded and names eroded. I guess we thought we'd tell some stories, leave some offerings, the usual spooky Halloween stuff. We showed up just after dark, the moon almost full, lighting up the headstones in that eerie silver way it does. There were 4 of us, and we had flashlights, but we kept them off for the most part. The moonlight was enough. After a bit of wandering, we found a good spot and settled down. The place was quiet, no crickets, no wind, just that heavy, suffocating quiet. We cracked some jokes, poured a drink for any lingering spirits, and just tried to keep it chill. Then we noticed that the mist rolling in from the woods didn't seem to be leaving. It just sat there, pooling around the bases of the stones, swallowing up anything below our knees. There was something, I don't know. The fog around the graves moved almost like it had a will of its own, clinging to the stones and spreading like fingers reaching out. We all started to feel it, the sudden weight, and it silenced us, fast. A creeping dread swept through, and everything just went wrong. I think it started with the faintest shift in the mist, like something rising. It wasn't immediate. It was more like each grave was breathing, rising and falling in unison. We should have left right then, but we were locked in place, almost hypnotized by the bizarre sight. The shadows around the stones stretched, warping into darkened figures that began to take shape, lifting themselves from the earth as if pulled up by an unseen hand. Each shape emerged, staggered and lurching, cloaked in decayed remnants, hollow spaces where faces should have been. And they kept coming, one after another, like the ground itself was vomiting them up. We saw old men in suits, women with remnants of tattered lace dresses, children's bones in crumbling shoes. The figures were empty, their eyes blank pits, their mouths half open as if gasping for something they'd lost long ago. As they gathered in some awful congregation, a faint hum started to build, vibrating through the mist. It wasn't a song, more like a low, discordant wail that felt wrong in the pit of my stomach. It rose slowly, gathering volume but no clarity. It was like they were trying to speak, but their words were long gone, replaced by sounds that shouldn't exist. The dead, now fully risen, moved together, forming an arc around us. We could feel their hollow eyes fixed on us, a primal awareness that crawled under our skin, leaving no doubt that they saw us. One figure stepped forward, and something in the very shape of it felt ancient, something deeper than flesh or bone. It tilted its head, a brittle hand raised as though beckoning us to join. That's when the spell broke, and we ran. My friends tripped over gravestones and roots, scraping knees and tearing skin, but we didn't look back. The last thing I remember is the chorus of that impossible hum growing louder, chasing us down the hill, an echo from another time that followed us even after we got in the car and sped away. I don't know how long we drove, but when we finally looked back, the graveyard was hidden, swallowed up by the fog. None of us have talked about what happened, and I don't think we will. But last night, I swear, I saw that fog in the fields outside my window, shifting as if it was remembering us, waiting. I don't know what that means, but I know one thing for sure. I'm not going back.